All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting episode of Dynamics of the Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to Professor James Moriarty, Napoleon of Crime, and archnemesis of Sherlock Holmes. It always feels like a miracle when I get through that line. I don't know why, but it does. I'm Madeline Quiñones, and I am joined by my lovely co-host,
Dixie Parkinson,
and our lovely temporary co-host,
Claire Daines.
Yay! Claire is back.
Hey guys, nice to be back.
This is a very big deal because we are all in 3 very separate time zones. It is the afternoon for me, it is evening for Dixie, and it is early in the morning for Claire. So it is very lovely of Claire, especially to be willing to do this.
7 a.m. on a Sunday. I must love you heaps.
Oh. And be that obsessive over Sherlockian.
That too.
So we are here for our very first story discussion episode. We are starting at the publication beginning with a study in Scarlet. It's not chronologically the first story, but I think it's still, even if you're gonna talk about stuff in chronological order, it still makes sense to start at the beginning with Study in Scarlet, because that's what really starts it all. So the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to give a quick story summary, and then we'll talk about all the stuff that we want to talk about the story, which is going to be lots of fun. Oh, Pud. There's a Pud.
say hi, Coco.
Hi, Coco. He is now YouTube famous. And then we are also going to talk about trying to shoehorn Professor Moriarty into Study in Scarlet. That's going to be fun. And then when we're done, there are, I think it, we would be remiss in talking about the story if we didn't also talk about some of the adaptations that have been done, because especially with this story, it's interesting to look at its history of being adapted more than like I think any other story. This one is the most interesting when it comes to adaptations. So and also as I go through the story summary, feel free to jump in and add stuff, you guys, but just trying to make it quick and fast here, because we do assume that if you're watching this podcast, you've probably read the story, you probably know it. But basically we first meet John H. Watson, late of the Army Medical Department, who has been invalided home from Afghanistan and goes through his money too quickly, has to pick up a roommate, and ends up roommating with the weirdest roommate in the history of roommates, Sherlock Holmes. And what's even weirder is that, and I have never been sure why exactly Holmes just never came out and told Watson until he did about what he did for a living. But for the longest time, he just lets it be a mystery to Watson, which is hilarious.
Maybe it was some kind of test.
Could have been.
See if Watson was worthy of joining him on cases.
Watson writes up the glorious list of Holmes's strengths and flaws, called Sherlock Holmes' Limits. It's hilarious. And finally, Holmes does tell Watson what he does, and right away, like magic, they get a summons from the police saying, like, come see this murder. And Holmes is like, hey, do you want to come see a murder? And Watson's like, well, I got nothing else better to do. So they go, and Holmes, of course, picks up a whole lot more clues than the police do. And he also better interprets the clues that the police do notice. And they go off investigating. Another murder happens. And in the end, Holmes manages to catch the murderer. And then suddenly we are catapulted into the American West, like, what is it? Something like 30, 40 years ago prior to the rest of the story. And we find out the backstory of why these murders happened, and jump back to the present. It is revenge killings for the sake of the girl who died because of these two men being apparently horrible human beings. And they're Mormon. So this whole bit has been controversial for the longest time because it does not paint the Mormons in a positive light, which is not unusual for the 1880s, but still, it didn't especially age well. And at the end, of course, Gregson and Lestrade get all the credit from the newspapers, as Holmes told Watson they would. And Watson's like, this is an outrage. I am outraged. I am going to write this up for you. And Holmes was like, oh, okay, cool. And that is basically the story of A Study in Scarlet, the very first Sherlock Holmes story, published in Beaton's Christmas Annual in 1887, more than a year, actually, after Doyle first submitted it. So he had to wait a long time. He was paid a paltry sum for it. And the story did not do well, unfortunately. It's not hard to see why it didn't do well, but still. But that is the story. So, let's jump right into the discussion. And I have some visual aids. This is a pirated copy of A Study in Scarlet. Ooh. I can tell that it's a pirated copy because it does not have a copyright page. Which if I understand pirated editions correctly, that's one of the tells. It has the publisher, but it does not have a copyright line. And then also, people might remember this from now it's not going to want to come out. Oh my gosh, it doesn't want to come out. From the 221B episode, my little miniature book is actually A Study in Scarlet also. It makes me so happy, and it makes me even happier if I could get the darn thing out. Oh, there we go. Yes? No? Yes. Come on. Come on, baby. And there we go. So cool. It's so cool. It's the entire story. Itty bitty. All right. So, starting story discussion. Seems logical to start with Watson.
Yeah.
Thoughts about him at the beginning?
So I actually mostly reread the story a little earlier while I was waiting for us to do this. And what I found interesting rereading it, because I haven't read it since the first time I read it, which was in 2011 or early 2012, so like 10 years ago, is the first time I noticed how prominent it is in the beginning that Watson is like, he's depressed, he's kind of shell-shocked from the war and everything, and Sherlock Holmes is basically what gets him back into the world again and like living his life. So I thought that was interesting. Because when you think of Watson, you don't really think that much of like the trauma that he went through in the war, but that's definitely an element in the beginning there.
Yeah. Well, he downplays himself. He always does, and it only gets worse over time. But in like these first two novels, especially, he's more open and honest about what's going on in his interior life, what he's thinking and feeling, and yeah, and of course, Martin Freeman's Watson and BBC Sherlock is probably the best, or the most well-known portrayal of a Watson with PTSD.
Yeah.
And they actually call it that. But yeah, and I mean, he's so young. He's actually like, he's younger than I am. He, you know, if let's see, what is it? It's like the pathway to being an MD in the UK is different from the US. There's less school and more intern or more practical experience, if I've understood it correctly. But the timeline is still about the same. So it would have taken from when Watson started college to when he got his MD, it would have been about 8 years or so. And then he goes to Netley's, and then he goes to India, and then Afghanistan. And so Watson basically like can't be any older than his late 20s in a study in Scarlet. He's in his late 20s when like his life kind of blows up on him because of these injuries. And I do think that he got both the shoulder and the leg wound in Afghanistan. And a theory that I came up with in recent times is that he only really brought up the shoulder injury in a study in Scarlet because that was the one that actually required him to, that actually would keep him from being a surgeon.
Yeah.
Because even if his left hand, and it was his left shoulder, if his left hand wasn't his dominant one, and it probably wouldn't have been because this is the Victorian era. You didn't have left-handed people, by hook or by crook. But you know, if you've got a surgeon, you want both hands working right. And like a surgeon could get around with a limp, but he couldn't get around with a hand that was unreliable. Which is why I think that he didn't mention the leg until Sign of the Four. But there is, and I have been so excited for this episode because I have wanted to talk about this essay, and of course I didn't bookmark it. As an idiot, I did not bookmark it. But in Corporals, Colonels, and Commissionaires, the Military and the Sherlockian Canon from BSI Press, there is a whole essay about the timeline of Watson's experience in the Army. Okay, so I found the essay. It's called The Old Campaigner, Dr. Watson's Military Service by Bill Mason. It kind of gives you a timeline of, Watson's military service. But something interesting that comes up is that the timeline of events that were given in the very start of a study in Scarlet doesn't actually match up with reality. It's like fast tracked. Watson, gets to where is it? I can't. Peshawar. Peshawar is where the hospital is in India, where Watson goes to recover and then ends up getting enteric or typhoid fever, right? But that would not have happened for a couple of months after my wand, because Watson must have reached the hospital in mid-October, nearly 3 months after the Battle of Maiwan, because it's about 480 miles from Kandahar to Peshawar. That's a long distance, especially for like a train of of injured soldiers to cover, and in a mountainous part of the world that it's not easy traveling around in Afghanistan. That is why it's not a good idea to go to war in Afghanistan ever. It's pretty hostile terrain. It's like almost impossible that Watson would have actually gotten onto the troop ship Orontes, because the timeline of like him getting to the hospital and then him getting sick, and he is sick for a couple of months, and that actually gets you up to December already. And so it's just real. I've said before, like every Sherlockian should get this book. It's a really, really good book because it gives you so much information about so many things. And this essay is just so worth the read. And I am so sorry that I am like mangling it completely. But basically then the take on the timeline of events is that, well, we actually, it hurts to say this, but we actually don't know for sure that Holmes and Watson met in 1881. Mm-hmm. We just assume it because my wand happened in 1880. But the essay holds that due to how much time these things would have taken in reality, and also that Watson needed to have spent at least a little while in London for him to like burn through his resources. That the essay puts forth the idea that Holmes and Watson met in 1882. Mm-hmm.
Or at the very least at the tail end of 1881.
Well, but that's true. That's true. Basically, the thing is that that the actual case of a study in Scarlet starts on March 4th, and chronology. Like chronology. This is going to be such a pain moving forward with this in chronological order. You know how much I cannot get into chronological order. It's a freaking lot. But I didn't want to go by anybody else's chronology because I don't agree with anybody else's chronology. Brad Kiefhofer has study in Scarlet happening in 1885. I don't remember why. And it's not that they met in 1885, but that the case took place in 1885. And I'm just like, no, it didn't, because Holmes sounds too young. He didn't even sound that young in Speckled Band, which is 1883. And then, of course, like the most popular chronology is William S. Baring Gould's chronology because of his biography, Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, and also he did the original annotated Sherlock Holmes. But his timeline has 3 Mrs. Watsons, and the first Mrs. Watson is a pre-Mary Mrs. Watson, to make sense of all those times before 1880, 87 or 88, that now Watson says he's married, but he didn't marry Mary until 87 or 88. But it's like, of course it was just Mary the whole time. It's just, I mean, it's either Doyle being goofy with his not caring about his dates, or Watson is, deliberately fudging things. But either way, it's Mary.
I mean, Watson is just too unsure of himself and the sign of the 4 for Mary to be his second wife.
That's another good thing. Yeah. Yes, he is. Oh my goodness. The poor boy has serious self-esteem issues.
That or his first wife was one hell of a shrew.
Goodness. Okay. Moving on from apology. So we get the famous meeting scene between Holmes and Watson, and you've been in Afghanistan, I perceive, and it has been noted that Watson could have just as easily, come from service in India specifically, and also that Afghanistan isn't the tropics, but I think that's just splitting hairs, because Afghanistan, I figure Afghanistan is the tropics to, a Brit in the 1880s.
It's a little odd given how well traveled Doyle is at this point. I mean, he's not exactly ignorant of foreign geography.
Is he that well traveled yet, though?
Oh, good point. When did he really start doing his round the world tours?
I don't think that he made it outside of Europe until the 1890s. So that's like when I take that, well, I mean, there was his whaling adventure, but that was in the North Atlantic. So I don't know. I know that he went to Egypt in 1890. Is it 96? He went to Egypt at the same time that war in the Sudan was breaking out. And then he left his wife and sister in Egypt, and he's he bullies a British newspaper into making him a war correspondent, and then takes off to go down to the Sudan to report on the hostilities. Never sees any action, but does actually speak with Lord Kitchener. But that is more than a decade after what we're talking about right now. So, people sometimes say that they don't like Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes because of his gesticulating. And Jeremy Brett himself said he doesn't think that that's right, but he had no control over it, and he thought that Basil Rathbone's stillness was more appropriate to the character. But then, I look at Holmes telling Watson about his Sherlock Holmes bloodstain test, and the way that he bows as if to an
Yes, I noticed
audience.
that. I thought that was funny.
It's so adorable, and it's he gesticulated a lot. That was just absolutely adorable.
And the energy that he puts into that searching the room at Lauriston Gardens. I mean, you get such a wonderful description from Watson about that. He's all over the place.
He's so adorable. He's so young. Okay, this is probably the best time right now to talk about how young Sherlock Holmes actually is in A Study in Scarlet. And you two know that this is something that I'm really passionate about, because you've only been hearing about it for the past 10 years. But I first read A Study in Scarlet when I was 20. And so I had like no serious preconceptions about Sherlock Holmes. I read a couple of the short stories previously, but I hadn't actually been exposed to any adaptations that would really color my view. Great Mouse Detective and Wishbone aren't really gonna color your perception of Sherlock Holmes. So I came at the story with a fresh view, and I'm reading, and I'm just like, well, Stanford still thinks that he's in university, and Sherlock Holmes just sounds really young and immature. And I mean, not like Sherlock Holmes is always a little bit immature, like no matter how old he gets, we know this. But it's a different kind of immaturity. I was just talking with a friend about this the other day. You know, like as you're going through your 20s, you're still growing up. You are a different person in your later 20s than you are in your earlier 20s. And I think that Sherlock Holmes bears this out. I think that he's in his later 20s when a lot of the stories and the adventures happen, and he's in his earlier 20s here. He just sounds like he really hasn't had he really has not had a lot of life experience yet. He's got a lot to learn. He is still figuring out his career. He is still figuring out I think he's still figuring out this whole adulting thing. Yeah. That is really the vibe that I get from him.
Yeah, so I'm reading it this time. I went into it thinking about that because you've talked about this in the past, and I got that exact same impression that he's young. I mean, the whole story, he's constantly like getting really excited every time anyone like flatters him and his methods, and it just it gives you the vibe of someone who's young and still not as sure of themselves as they like to portray that they are.
Yeah, for sure. In essence, he baby. So moving on, and once again, like I should have like bookmarked stuff, right? But I just want to really quickly read Sherlock Holmes, His Limits, because I feel like this should always be read in a discussion of A Study in Scarlet, because it's just so great. So, number 1, knowledge of literature, nil. Number 2, philosophy, nil. Number 3, astronomy, nil. Number 4, politics, feeble. Number 5, knowledge of botany, variable. Well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons generally. Knows nothing of practical gardening. It's like, why would he know anything of practical gardening? What does Watson know of practical gardening? That's the real question. Number 6, geology, practical but limited. Tells at a glance different soils from each other. After Watts has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistence in what part of London he had received them. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. Anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. Sensational literature, immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetrated in the century. Plays the violin well. Is an expert single stick player, boxer, and swordsman. Has a good practical knowledge of British law. What a list.
Well, the knowledge of literature nil isn't very fair. I mean, Holmes is constantly quoting in the stories, but especially French literature.
Yeah, well, and he quotes Shakespeare all the time.
Yeah, the game is afoot. Henry V.
Yeah. He quotes Twelfth Night twice, which is part of the justification for his birthday being on January 6th. And yeah, it's pretty funny. Actually, you know what? I'll pull this back up. This is The Boys Sherlock Holmes. It is it's a collection that includes Study in Scarlet, Sign of the Four, and a few of the adventures stories. And when was it published? This was published in the latest copyright is 1936, so this is probably 1936. And this was actually the book that got me started on Sherlock Holmes, more or less. And I almost, as a teenager, rather than as a 20-year-old, started reading Sherlock Holmes because for some reason I was in my brother's room and picked this up off the shelf. I do not remember why this happened. This was almost 20 years ago. Don't like that. I don't like that. But I opened it up and it was the bit about the solar system. And I was like, oh, wait a second, Sherlock Holmes doesn't know that the earth revolves around the sun? That's hilarious. And I was like, that's such a good little character bit. And that got me more interested in Sherlock Holmes than reading Speckled Man, Red-Headed League, or Norwood Builder. Which is funny, because those are three of my favorite stories now. But those stories build on what we're given in Study in Scarlet. Without Study in Scarlet, you don't really have so much that foundation of who these two characters are. And that's why Study in Scarlet, which was such a great start for me, because you know, I really don't care so much about plot. Just give me characters to love and I'm happy. But you gotta, like, you know, tell me who they are. And that's what Study in Scarlet does. So for those reasons, I love it. I don't know, any other thoughts about like Holmes and Watson in this introductory period before the mystery gets underway?
Yeah, it's pretty obvious that Holmes, after Watson's traumatic experiences, pretty much saved his life. I mean, if he'd just been left to continue on as he was doing, he probably would have put that Webley of his to a very bad use.
Yeah.
After a few more months.
Yeah. Yeah, and too, like, I have Sherlock everywhere, the same guys, but Scott Monty and Bert Wolger. They also, aside from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, they also do a podcast called Trifles, where they just look at different little bits in the canon and then talk about them or read other people's essays about them. And they just did an episode where they kind of read from an essay by Susan Rice, by the late Susan Rice, R.I.P. who wrote this essay about Watson's apparent gambling addiction. And it was a really good episode. I recommend you guys go and listen to it. It was a good essay. But something that Scott and Bert talked about was that, like, that we know now that addiction or a tendency towards addiction is something in our DNA. And of course, we know that Watson's brother was an alcoholic and probably died from that. So it's also not too far stretched to think that that something similar could have happened to John Watson as well. So we always talk about, like, and Jeremy Brett did too, about, like, Watson saving Holmes, but Holmes really saved Watson just as much.
We've got two people with addictive personalities living in the same flat.
Oh, that's a recipe for fireworks.
Uh-huh.
But I think the nice thing is that they balance each other out in different ways, which is really, I think, how they save each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Holmes pushes Watson towards being more involved in life again, and Watson kind of, like, tries to hold Holmes's excesses in. So yeah, you're right. They even their approaches they complement each other. So the actual Lauriston Gardens mystery itself, it's interesting that Gregson calls Holmes in the first place, because even though they can't exactly figure out what's going on, I don't feel like it's that remarkable of a murder mystery. Yeah, there are no snakes, no daughters locked in the attic, not even Indian treasure, like we'll get in the very next story. We did, to be fair, we do have the American West and Mormons, which I suppose would be pretty exotic to the British in the 1880s, but
Poisons from South America.
and it's also weird that it's Gregson, and I mean, this also, I don't know how common it was to have in real life to have two police inspectors on the same case like this, where it's just especially where it's just one murder. It starts out with just being one murder. So why are Gregson and Lestrade both there? And also Doyle never does it again. He never has. Okay, I lied. Valley of Fear, he has two inspectors. That's the only other one that I can think of.
The chemistry between those two inspectors. Maybe that's the problem. Doyle didn't like them taking attention away from Holmes and Watson.
I don't know, but it's such a shame because they are so entertaining. They hate each other, and it's hilarious. Well, Gregson especially doesn't like Lestrade. We don't get so much Lestrade's feelings on Gregson. But Gregson is definitely condescending, and we do eventually find out that Lestrade does not like being condescended to. So you can draw your own conclusions. But it hurts because I just love, like, why haven't we not yet had a buddy cop movie that is the two of them just, like, hurling insults at each other the whole time? It would just be amazing. Somebody needs to get on that.
Maybe that's where we get all those buddy cop movies from. The forerunners.
Maybe. I don't know. But I love their dynamic in this story, and I always love writing it myself. And gotta make a big shout out really quick to one of my favorite Sherlock authors, Marshall Wilson, who writes stuff that tends to be focused on Lestrade and the Scotland Yarders, and it's just wonderful. And she does so well with Lestrade and Gregson, especially. And I can't wait for the rest of those books to come out. I hope that real life permits that sooner rather than later. But so yeah, those two are great. Right off the bat, is Sherlock Holmes is investigating. We really see him really working the crime scene. And of course, this is why Doyle wrote this story in the first place, because he wanted to show a detective investigating a crime scene the way that Dr. Joseph Bell would diagnose a patient who came into him to see him, because Joe Bell did the analysis and deduction thing in real life that Sherlock Holmes did in the stories. And Doyle was like, there should be detective stories in which a detective is as good investigating as my university professor was. So and I think none of the things that Holmes deduces in this story are really out there. I feel like the deductions are pretty solid. Like sometimes it's like, I don't know about that, but for the most part, I can't think of anything that doesn't sound like it's a reasonable conclusion. Okay, I'm gonna sort of pull in briefly, sort of my take on the Moriarty connection. So the murder, of course, has a Confederate, the probably young man who came to 221B disguised as an old woman to pick up a wedding ring, and Holmes follows him into a cab, and then Holmes is hanging on the back. I don't know how the cab driver doesn't. I guess the cab driver is in front. It's like, what kind of cab is this? I don't even know what kind of cab this is. It's like, if the cab driver is in the back, that can't work, right? But if he's in front, that'd work.
Yeah, I assumed he was in front because otherwise it's not going to work.
Right. and then somehow the guy in disguise gets out of a moving cab without either the cab driver or Holmes noticing that happened.
That's an impressive feat.
Right? That's really impressive. And so my proposition is that this young man is none other than John Clay from the Red-Headed League. Holmes does actually say in Red-Headed League, I've had one or two little turns also with Mr. John Clay. Clay does have, quote unquote, almost womanly hands and a boyish face. So he could conceivably, actually, believably disguise himself as a woman. And I think it's just possible that it could be him. And without getting too deep,
how Holmes worked it out afterwards.
Yeah. But without going too deep into the Moriarty connection yet, I also think that if it was John Clay, he was already working for Moriarty. That is as much as we will get into that for the moment, I think. Of course, we have the appearance of the Baker Street Irregulars. he'll only show up for one more story, and then one more mention in another story, and then they're never heard from again. But I love those kids. Wish we'd gotten more of them. Well, so finally, they do catch the murderer, and it's kind of weird because Holmes is already, because it's like Jefferson Hope should know the address from the newspaper advertisement.
Yeah.
Yeah, he should have been very suspicious.
And to his credit, Bert Cools, who kind of showran the BBC radio series with Clive Merrison and Michael Williams, did actually address this point between Holmes and Watson in the Study in Scarlet episodes, because Hope says something like he doesn't want to go down in history as a simple murderer. He wants his story to be known. Or Holmes rather deduces that he wants his story to be known, and that's why he essentially gives himself up, even though he still fights it for a minute, probably out of surprise more than anything. But it does make a certain amount of sense, because as we find out, Jefferson Hope is dying. He has an aneurysm, and in fact, he does actually die before he can go to trial. So when he tells Holmes and Watson and Gregson and Lestrade his story, it is, the last chance that the four of them have to actually find out, what all has been happening, like why this all happened in the first place. And so that gets us to the infamous Mormon part of the Study in Scarlet. And so this is actually why Claire is here to talk about all the research that she's done on this part of the story. But really quickly, I want to get into the geography of what we're looking at. I promise this won't take long, but this is, for some reason, this has always just bothered me. The Great Alkali Plains. It's a fantasy land. Nowhere like that exists in the US. Or if it does, it exists on it. We do have salt flats. There are salt flats in Nevada, and where I think the sound barrier has been broken.
Yeah.
But nowhere on the scale of what Doyle is describing. So I am going to share my screen. So it turns out that there was a thing known as the Great American Desert, which people believe is where Doyle got the Great Alkali Plains from. This is a map that was, I think, made in the 1820s. It was still the earlier half of the 19th century, and I'm not even sure what all I'm looking at here. Well, there's Arkansas and Missouri. So there's just this. They saw this as this big desert here, and over here is New Mexico, and so this map does not accurately portray reality at all. But it is worth noting that apparently the definition of desert used to be different. That a desert used to be defined as land that was not suitable for agriculture. which makes a certain amount of sense because, you know, the less that you can till land, the less hospitable it is to sustain human life. Humans can live anywhere, but some parts of the world are harder to live in than others. So desert, the Great American Desert actually included prairie. It included lands that did, you know, have plant life, that had water, but like it included the Great Plains, which are not, they are not as suitable for farming as land east of the Mississippi. So this is probably where the Great Alkali Plains came from, this notion of the Great American Desert. I was reading an article on Wikipedia about it, and apparently, like, or no, this also came up in the new annotated Sherlock Holmes, one of the first footnotes in the Mormon section, that eventually, like, the Great American Plains just kind of, or the Great American Desert just kind of faded away as a term that just could not be applied anymore because people kept recognizing that, oh, this wasn't actually desert, and this wasn't actually desert, and this is this, and it's just funny. So that's the basis. But then, so here, as best as I can figure, is Doyle's idea of the Great Alkali Plain. To be fair, some of this area is desert, real desert. A lot of it is not. He describes it, and once again, I should have actually had this handy, but you'd think by now that I would learn to bookmark things, and I never learned.
How many square miles does that red area cover?
Oh, that is so much area. I mean, even nowadays, let's say from Colorado's eastern border to Nevada's western border, that's at least a whole day of driving. If you're going just by interstates, if you're going slower than interstate speed, that's at least a couple of days. So that's a very big distance. Here we go. In the central portion of the great North American continent, there lies an arid and repulsive desert, which for many a long year served as a barrier against the advance of civilization. That is untrue on so many levels. From the Sierra Nevada to Nebraska, and from the Yellowstone River in the north to the Colorado upon the south, is a region of desolation and silence. You know, the Yellowstone and Colorado rivers are kind of like all over the place. So even figuring that out was kind of difficult, but this was this red area is like the best that I could figure for the Great Alkali Plains. Now, this shows from, as best as I could figure, looking this up, like the real desert spaces in at least in the United States and in part of Mexico. So you can see that there is definitely some overlap, but not as far north or east as Doyle had imagined. And of course, part of the Alkali Plain is really the Great Plains, which themselves are pretty dry and desolate, especially at the height of summer, which is why, and then too, before I get into that, before I forget, bless the National Park Service for having a map on their website of the Mormon Trail. So this doesn't show the whole trail, just shows some relevant bits here. And like any sensible people headed west, they went along rivers. So they traveled along the Platte River in Nebraska and into Wyoming, and then I'm not familiar with all the Wyoming rivers, but I believe that there were other rivers that they followed then down into Utah. Now some of Wyoming is a little bit desertish. A lot of it though is prairie. And it would have been somewhere in Wyoming, which is definite where it would definitely not have been desert, that the Mormons came upon John and Lucy Ferrier. So
And certainly nowhere near the Rio Grande.
nowhere near the Rio Grande. They mentioned that. I was saying last night that's jumped out at me and never noticed that before, that they were talking about trying to reach the Rio Grande, and that's like the opposite direction from Salt Lake City, future Salt Lake City, that is. It's just like, what are you trying to, why? Especially because going down towards the Rio Grande would have taken them into territory that was like kind of unstable, because the US and Mexico would be duking it out between each other, and also Texas would be duking it out. So it's like, if you're the Mormons were looking for a place to live in peace, going down to the Rio Grande would have been a good idea. But yeah, so like the thing is that the caravan that John Ferrier has been a part of, they've all died, and they're supposed to have died in this big terrible desert. They died on the prairie in Wyoming. They didn't die. They did not die anywhere near any of the real, the genuine American deserts. Now, mind you, especially, and I don't know what the weather would have been like in, what is it, 1847 or something. I don't know what the weather was like. But that part of the world does tend to go through droughts. And at the height of summer, a lot of the area covered by the Great Plains, covered by the prairie, does get really dry and really hot. So like people could have still, if they lost their way and got too far away from any significant water sources, they could still have died.
Yeah, but if you notice in the text, John talks about one of the people in their caravan is a person called Indian Joe. Wouldn't they have some kind of clue as to how to get water or where to find it?
Yeah, that also occurred to me.
I suspect that it wasn't a lack of water that was the problem, but that the water was contaminated.
Yeah, that's entirely possible.
Could have been a cholera outbreak that wiped out the caravan.
Yeah. But yeah, and I mean, and to be fair, the Great Plains at the height of summer too, also hot, dry and hot. I don't know if either of you have ever been like at about 3,000 feet above sea level in the summertime, but the sun is hotter. The sun really is just more intense at a higher elevation than it is at a lower one. And like all of Wyoming is at a higher elevation. So I'm sure that that the heat didn't help. But still, not a real desert. And it just, I think that the reason that it bothers me is because I've been, you guys know that I've been to Wyoming lots of times.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when I was little, my family used to go down through the Southwest. We used to visit family in Denver, in San Diego. I have been through the real American desert. It's, very, very awesome places to be in. I've been to the Grand Canyon. I've been to Four Corners, so I have had hands and feet in, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. And actually, that is all Four Corners. There's like nothing around Four Corners. That is desert. So it's just like, I think it's like for those reasons that this part bothers me. It's just, and I was thinking about it earlier, and I was like, you gotta let this go. You gotta let this go. And so now I'm just thinking like, this story is being told by Jefferson Hope. And potentially Jefferson Hope just didn't actually tell them anything about the terrain. Like Watson potentially just had to like figure that all out on his own. And also, who knows how good British resources on American West geography were. So I think
We're showing off his ignorance.
So yeah, I think that Jefferson Hope didn't really tell them about the geography, and Watson just tried to figure it out on his own, or Doyle, if Doyle's writing this, because it's also suspected that while Watson writes the first part of the study and Scarlet, Doyle writes the second part. But yeah, they didn't know what they were talking about.
Yeah, a lot of the descriptions about the terrain in A Study in Scarlet. If you've ever read Robert Louis Stevenson's New Arabian Nights series, there's a short story in there called The Destroying Angel, which is about the Mormons of Utah. You read Stevenson first, and then in A Study in Scarlet, you start getting a serious case of deja vu. So it's possible that Doyle's either cribbing from Stevenson, either consciously or unconsciously, or they may just have read the same books about the American West.
I remember hearing something about the two of them, like were they friends? Is Doyle a fan? Something. I need to look into this now. I don't remember where I heard it. Might have been Watsonian Weekly even. Anyway. Yeah. So, they're nowhere near the Rio Grande. Also, the Sierra Blanco, which itself, if you know anything about Spanish, Sierra Blanco would never have existed as a name, because Sierra is feminine. It would have been Sierra Blanca. But there are actually some mountains called the Sierra Blanca, but they're in New Mexico. So also nowhere near. Still nowhere near. But yeah. So yeah. John and Lucy, who are not actually related, but John adopts Lucy since her mother passed. They are saved by the Mormons, who are this is the original Mormon pioneering expedition to Utah, and they make it to Utah, and the story describes the building of Salt Lake City. The writing is certainly very descriptive. It's excellent. It's just funny because, you know, just a few pages ago, Sherlock Holmes is saying, okay, gents, you can ask questions now, and I will give you all the answers. And immediately we cut to desert. All right, we are now in Utah, so I think, Claire, this is a good time to talk about all the stuff that you have uncovered.
Yeah, well, I've been researching for a sequel to A Study in Scarlet, in which Drebber and Stankerson are not the black villains that Jefferson Hope paints them as in his account, although Drebber is still Hope's rival. Yeah, and Drebber's surviving wives are also going to be central characters. For this book, I really wanted to know if the Mormon Church actually deserved the bad press it gets in A Study in Scarlet. Of course, the answers I got weren't that simple. I've read through a whole bunch of different perspectives, like the official manifesto from the modern-day Mormon Church, statements from Presidents Joseph Smith and Brigham Young, scholarly articles on the 19th century Mormons, and one very interesting expose by a woman called Fanny Stenhouse that was published in 1872. Fanny Stenhouse was a Mormon missionary for 20 years, so she was very familiar with what polygamy was really like and being a Mormon. Mormons publicly claimed, especially the women, that they were completely happy in their polygamous relationships, and that the wives actually had more equality with their husbands than women in monogamous marriages. Now, that was a complete fabrication. But as Fanny reveals in her book, if any Mormon had dared to break ranks and tell the actual truth, they were going to be in big trouble. Not only from their husbands and the church, but from the other women in their community. They'd be completely ostracized. I mean, Mormon husbands might have treated their wives as mere cattle with brains to match, but they saw and heard most of what was going on around them. And their experiences are going to be an integral part of my book, not a side note like they are in A Study in Scarlet.
I'm really looking forward to that book. It's going to hurt, but I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. One of the titles of Fanny's book is Tell It All, and boy, howdy it does. The main reason she was able to tell such a detailed and compelling story is because she was intimately acquainted with many of the other women in the community. She'd even converted a fair few of them to Mormonism in Europe, such as Switzerland, and they shared her disillusionment and outrage when the new polygamy doctrine was announced, because that was a new thing. A lot of them had become Mormons before that was announced. They were not happy that suddenly they were going to have to share their husbands with a whole bunch of other women.
I wouldn't be happy either.
And Fanny was also close friends with a few of the wives of President Brigham Young. You want to know what a man's really like? Ask his wife. One of the chapters reveals that Joseph Smith's divine revelation from God about polygamy only happened, funnily enough, after his wife caught him practicing it. If he didn't want to be in the doghouse for the rest of his married life, he had to think fast. So he ends up dragging all his followers into the same mire as himself.
Nothing like divine revelation to get you out of the doghouse.
I mean, Brigham Young whinges, "It was the first time in my life that I desired the grave. When I saw a funeral, I felt to envy the corpse's situation and to regret that I was not in the coffin. Well, it clearly didn't take him very long to get over that. By the time Young died, he'd had over 50 wives. I mean, by that time, some of them were dead or had run away.
We should put it out at this point that you can read Fanny Stenhouse's book online at Project Gutenberg, and also where was it that you got it from? Was it Google Books?
I got my copy off Google Books. It's available for download.
Yeah. So it is possible to easily go read this for yourself for free. And I'm not sure that I'm up for that.
Yeah, you definitely want a box of Kleenex while you're reading it. And some of it takes a strong stomach, like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The husband of Fanny Stenhouse, Thomas, he was the editor for one of the Salt Lake City newspapers. Young objected to Thomas's acceptance of the growing number of Gentiles in Utah, instead of publishing nasty articles about them in his paper. He tried to ruin him by forcing him to sell up and relocate the paper to a poor settlement who couldn't have afforded to buy it. So yes, the Stenhouses perhaps foolishly, openly declared that they were leaving the Mormon church, and Young sent his assassins. They were very lucky to get with their lives. Yeah, Doyle was right on the money about how hard it was to get away from the Mormon church once you'd converted. Although that countdown in a study in Scarlet is way over the top. I mean, how did the Mormons get into a bolted cabin to leave those notes without supernatural powers?
You know, I've said this before. I feel like, you know, Doyle has a good cult thriller here, and that countdown, that is like scary stuff. But as you say, it has no basis in reality. But it is scary. It's a good, it's like good thriller material. But he like makes the mistake of having these two disparate stories together. You've got a murder mystery with a scientific detective, and then you've got a cult thriller, and they don't really mesh terribly well. It's like there's not, you know, he tries to marry them, and they don't even divorce. They just, by mutual consent at the altar, decide to go their own separate ways. Just looking over your notes here. So how about the other details that Doyle got wrong about the Mormons? So let's see.
Yeah, for instance, when Lucy and John Ferrier are found, they wouldn't have been forced to become Mormons in exchange for rescue. Yeah, they would have been rescued anyway. Although the Mormons, smelling two possible new converts, would certainly have preached at them all the way to Salt Lake City. And there is no way that John Ferrier could have gotten as rich as he does in the story as a farmer without taking at least one wife. Yeah. The elders would have considered that such an eligible bachelor had a positive duty to get married, and going against the church in something so fundamental would have meant death. Yep, Lucy would have become an orphan again very quickly and given to some other family to raise, with the expectation of becoming a plural wife herself once she became of age.
And then you also wrote that the timing of Lucy's marriage was a big deal. So let's get into that.
On the story, John Ferrier's grave marker is dated 1860. That was just 4 years after the beginning of the Mormon Reformation in 1856. That was a spiritual revival that Fanny Stenhouse in her book calls a reign of terror, and I quote, in which every saint seemed to have gone stark crazy mad, unquote. Yeah, before the Reformation, Lucy might not have been forced to marry Deborah Stangerson, even if she had converted to Mormonism, although the emotional and spiritual blackmail from the church elders to give in would have gone on indefinitely. But from 1856, she wouldn't have had any choice at all. As during and after the Reformation, young men and women, even children as young as 12, were often forced into marriage, including polygamy. I mean, Stenhouse writes, The marrying mania, in fact, was universal and irresistible. Everyone must marry or be given in marriage. So evidently was this the case that women in jest said that if one were to hang a petticoat upon a fence pole, half a dozen men would flock at once to marry it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Before the Reformation, a first wife theoretically had to consent before her husband could marry again. And there were even guidelines for courting a prospective plural wife, which included the approval of her parents. But in reality, of course, the pressure was that a first wife would face from her husband, and the church to agree to another wife was awful. And same went for the prospective new bride. Either of them might be in danger of being killed as an apostate if they refused. Ultimately, if Brigham Young thought the marriage should go ahead, that was the end of it.
But interestingly, they actually allowed wives to apply for divorce, which is something that was extremely uncommon back then.
Yeah, that is the one way in which Mormon wives actually had more freedom than their counterparts in single marriages. Yeah, if Lucy had been forced to the altar in 1860 after John Ferriar's death, she could have applied for divorce afterwards. The going rate for divorce at the time was about $10, which is around $350 in today's money. So if her unhappy Mormon wife had the money, she could get a divorce, even if she wasn't actually being mistreated, although she had to be very strong-willed and courageous to apply for one. Yeah. The men weren't so lucky, though. If any of a Mormon's wives decided they were better off in the relationship, he was stuck with them. After all, for a lot of these women, marriage meant more financial security than being on their own, which they sometimes considered worth hanging on to, even if they were unhappy.
It was back then it was definitely rough if you were a single woman. So it unfortunately makes a tragic amount of sense. And then Mormons didn't actually use wedding rings.
No, they didn't. Yeah, that was sort of considered a Gentile custom. I mean, a man might buy a ring for a new wife while they were courting or as a symbol of their engagement, but they weren't exchanged during the ceremony to seal their vows. I mean, it kind of makes sense. I mean, otherwise somebody like Brigham Young might have looked like he was wearing knuckle dusters by the time he got to his 50th marriage. That means in a study in Scarlet, Lucy's ring must have been given to her by Drebber before the wedding. I mean, not that it makes much difference, but it would explain why Drebber has no wedding ring of his own when his corpse is discovered, just his Masonic signet ring.
That's a lot. I am so impressed that you dug all that up.
And there's still a lot to go.
Oh, I'm sure, but thank you for sharing all that, because that was, I mean, myself, I know very little of the historic Mormon church, and yeah, it's just fascinating. And of course, in one of his American tours late in life, Doyle did formally apologize to the Mormon church for his portrayal of them in A Study in Scarlet. The interesting thing is that especially with that kind of like rocky beginning, if it feels like we still have cults pop up nowadays, but they tend to last for just like maybe a couple of decades tops because they're unsustainable. They crash and burn. The interesting thing about the Mormon church is that it got past its like cult period, and it managed to survive past any sort of like crash and burn moment, and is recognized today as a more or less respectable religion. So it's just interesting. I think I think Doyle must have been at least maybe a little bit embarrassed, because it's quite reasonable to suspect that he might have thought that the Mormon church wouldn't even be around in another decade or so, you know, but they lasted. So that's just interesting. And I do want to say, with all of this, we're not trying to step on anybody's toes. And I know there are some Mormon Sherlockians out there who, you know, this story is a tricky topic for them. We are just looking at the historical record. That's all that we're doing. And trying to understand, you know, what things would have really been like for John and Lucy, especially. And of course, the many Mrs. Drebbers and Stangersons. So, but yeah, I really look forward to that book. That's gonna really, there has definitely never been anything like that, as far as I know, in the world of pastiche in this fandom. So it's gonna be good. So yeah, we cut back to the present day, and Jefferson Hope, who of course had, you know, tried to marry Lucy, and that's where all the trouble comes from. He explains his motivations through this story, and he's like, I've got nothing to lose because I'm dying. And of course, indeed, he does die just a few days later, a couple of days later even. It's not that long afterwards. And even though he doesn't make it to trial, the newspapers still praise Gregson and Lestrade for tying up the case. And Holmes is like, see, I told you so. And Watson's like, this is an outrage. I am outraged. And
rat-faced Watson.
He's like, you should write this up. You should write up your own account of this. And if you don't, I will do it for you. And that is exactly what he does. And actually, circling back to the very beginning, the opening of the story says that it is a reprint from the memoirs of John H. Watson. So that indicates that Beaton's Christmas Annual is not the first time that Watson has tried to publish a study in Scarlet. And it's just like, did he try self-publishing before? And that didn't get very far. I mean, it's possible. Holmes's pamphlet series is self-published. But yeah, that part just has always intrigued me. Like, when did Watson actually first write a study in Scarlet? And or rather, when did he first try to publish it?
What kind of demands on Watson's pocketbook would that make, trying to publish his own pamphlet?
I have no idea what it would have cost back then. I've never tried looking that up.
Compared to taking it to an actual publisher.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the end, the only publisher that he could get was Ward Lock & Co. publishing it in a Christmas annual. So he didn't do too well when he actually got it traditionally published. So, yeah. So that is basically a study in Scarlet. We still got to get into our Moriarty connection. So I talked a little bit about John Clay earlier, and the thing about like trying to fit Moriarty into stories is that Valley of Fear actually went a long way in helping us out in that regard.
Mm.
Because what Moriarty does in Valley of Fear is that, like, these Americans come to him and they're like, we need to find this. I mean, this is, this is implied to happen off screen. American crooks come to him and they're like, we need to find this guy. We need to get revenge on him. And Moriarty's like, cool, I can do that for you. I'm good at finding people. So he finds oh my gosh, John Douglas in Burlstone Manor, and determines that John Douglas is actually Bertie Edwards. And he's like, so here's your guy, go for it. And then when the Americans fail in their revenge attempt, Moriarty is apparently still being paid because Bertie Edwards does eventually die, and Holmes believes that it was Moriarty who was responsible for his death. So what this gives us is that Moriarty will find people for other people to get revenge on them. And what is this story about but somebody getting revenge on two people? So my attempt to shoehorn Moriarty into a study in Scarlet is that Jefferson Hope, possible, who knows, to like how much Moriarty chooses to reveal about his organization to prospective clients. It's possible that not everybody who hires his people services know that they are terrible people. But Jefferson Hope hires Moriarty services to find Drebber and Stangerson, and then gets hooked up with John Clay to go in disguise to get Lucy's ring back. So I think that is I think that there are going to be other times when I'm going to have to like really reach to get Moriarty involved in the story. I don't feel like this one is so much of a reach. I think that it's fairly plausible.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Actually, so too, worth noting is that it's also possible that Moriarty and Moran were meeting about this time.
Mhm.
Might not have been for the first time, but this might have been when their business association began. As indeed, and let's just hop right in here really quick to Adaptations. That is what happens in Kim Newman's Moriarty, the Head of the Dubervilles. Moran is discharged, goes home to England, and gets hooked up with Moriarty. And this book is actually a collection of, it's only like 6 or 7 stories. I hesitate to call them short stories because this is a big book, but it's a collection of stories. And the first one, a volume in Vermilion, does also connect Moriarty and Moran to a study in Scarlet, although it goes about it from a different tact. And I wasn't about to try to summarize it. It's been years since I actually read it, and I was like, I don't actually have time to read it now. I'm trying to get through the original story. But yeah, Hunt of the Dubervilles is a fun read. They're both truly terrible people, but it is a fun read. So there's that in terms of adaptations. Apparently also Study in Scarlet was one of the first Sherlock Holmes stories to be adapted to the screen. In 1914, Doyle authorized a British silent film. And it is now a lost movie. There was another Study in Scarlet that was an American silent film, also a lost movie, and it was not authorized by Doyle. Slightly more famously, there's a 1933 film, A Study in Scarlet, starring Reginald Owen as Sherlock Holmes, and Anna May Wong, who was a famous Chinese American actress of the time. What is it? The History Channel's podcast, History This Week, recently did an episode about Anna May Wong. And it is a really good listen. I do recommend it. She was a pretty remarkable character. But anyway, the Reginald Owen film has no plot relation to the novel, so that's always fun. But apparently, the plot is very similar to, or something about the plot is similar to an Agatha Christie story, or rather, one of the Agatha Christie stories, and then there were none. So that's
one of my favorites.
Apparently she got some inspiration. So this story has also been adapted multiple times for radio. Edith Meiser, who was one of the early Sherlockian greats, she adapted A Study in Scarlet into a 4-part serial for the radio series The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The episodes aired in November and December 1931. So that was before she was writing for Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce on the radio. In the 1950s, of course, you get the Ronald Howard series. They only adapt a few of the canon stories, and the first episode is not a Study in Scarlet adaptation, but it does show Holmes and Watson meeting, Holmes doing the blood test, and at the end, Lestrade gets the credit, and Watson actually goes storming off to give Lestrade a piece of his mind, which he actually does at the start of the very next episode. So I love Howard Marion Crawford's Watson. He's just a delight. So let's see. Apparently, this is also one of the stories that the BBC adapted for their TV series, Sherlock Holmes, with Peter Cushing and Nigel Stock. I have no idea if this is one of the episodes that's still extant, or if this is one of the lost Peter Cushing episodes. But that would be interesting to see. I've seen a couple of the Peter Cushing episodes, and I never expected to, but I do really like him as Sherlock Holmes. He can be kind of adorable himself.
Yeah.
Of course, there are the animated movies that star Peter O'Toole voicing Sherlock Holmes. They did the 4 novels, and that was it. And I have heard that those movies are unfortunately quite boring, which is a shame, because Sherlock Holmes gets adapted into animation like so little, and especially if you did like all 4 stories and you're gonna make them boring. Oh, terrible. So there's also the Soviet series that stars Vasily Livanov and Vitaly Solomon as Holmes and Watson. There are a series of TV movies, but like they were each broken up into like individual episodes. So the movie Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson The first episode focuses on Holmes and Watson meeting and moving in and learning to live together. They do the solar system bit, but they do this, they do a slightly different take on it. Watson gets like kind of very melancholy and philosophical, and he's like, imagine a world in which you couldn't talk with somebody about something that wasn't necessary to your profession. And he just is, because Holmes's whole reason behind not knowing about the solar system, how it works, is because it's not important to his line of work. And Watson's like, that would be kind of a sad world if everybody was like that. And then Holmes notices that Watson's gotten melancholy, and he's like, oh, hey, Watson, don't feel bad. I am sure I am the only weirdo like this. Is the gist of it. It's really cute. But then the funny thing is, because Holmes lives such a weird life, a buildup of circumstances leads Watson to believe that Sherlock Holmes is a serial killer. It's hilarious. He believes that Holmes is following him around. He goes out and he has a conversation with Stanford telling him about this, and he's like, I think he's watching us right now. It's so funny. They end up like literally duking it out, and then it moves on into the first case that they solve together, which is actually the speckled band. That's their first case together. And that's the whole first episode. And I still haven't seen the series in whole, and I need to commit to that at some point, because I do really like it and highly recommend it. It's lovely. But then the second episode is the plot line of A Study in Scarlet. It is the mystery plot line. And that is a thing that they would do with their movies. They would take like two cases and combine them together and remix them. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. Not that long afterwards, you've got the radio adaptation with Clive Merrison and Michael Williams. They are excellent right out of the gate as Holmes and Watson, even though both of them are like 2 decades too old to be playing these characters, like audibly too old. They do not sound like young men, but they are delightful nevertheless. And the funny thing about the Sherlock Holmes His Limits bit, the way that Bert Coules got that into the story was that Holmes found Watson's list. I mean, he tried to burn it, but it didn't burn very well. So he finds it, reads it and memorizes it, and then recites it back at Watson to kind of give him a bit of a hard time. And it's pretty funny. And he
The
does
accompaniment of the violin, if I recall.
yes. Yeah. So I love that bit. Love it. And then the Mormon part of the story is narrated by Jefferson Hope, which was a good choice for handling that bit. But yeah, I love the BBC radio series, and I always highly recommend it. It's wonderful. In recent history, very recent history, we've got Moriarty the Patriot, the manga and the anime, which adapt A Study in Scarlet as A Study in S, which is a two-parter. And it's still the basic events of the story, but Holmes is believed to be the murderer, because of what is it? Like somebody leaves his name at the crime scene or something, I think. So he's believed to be the murderer and arrested. And then at the end, it's shown to be, I mean, everything that happened was real, but the specific way that it was orchestrated is shown to be an elaborate plot of Moriarty's. So that is quite an interesting take on the story. Once again, I feel like I need to warn people, it's a good show, but also you got to be aware that it gets really, really dark right out of the gate. And I mean child endangerment dark. So there is that. It's like I always want to recommend it, but I feel like it really has to be recommended with that qualifier. That's important. And of course, probably most famously, this story has been adapted as a study in pink. That's my favorite BBC Sherlock episode, really.
I really like how they adapted the word Raka into an actual woman's name, Rachel. A nice nod to the original story.
Yeah.
Like everything about how Stephen Moffat handled the adaptation of it, I just feel like was just brilliant. The way that he managed to update it, like everything just really held together. I feel like in a way that like I think as adaptations of stories, maybe only Hounds of Baskerville comes close in terms of them updating it. But I feel like they just got it really right out of the gate. And then I love the whole show, but it was, I just feel like magic lightning in a bottle. They just never quite got it as right as that very first episode. Which is funny because that wasn't even their first attempt at adapting it. There's also the pilot. The pilot was weird. And apparently it was the success of the Robert Downey Jr. movie that then made the BBC go, you know what? We'll take that show. You redo the pilot and we will take that show. And good instincts, because BBC Sherlock ended up being an overnight global phenomenon. But yeah, that's just my favorite episode. It's so good.
Yeah, it is. And of course, they found a way to sneak Moriarty into the story.
They did. Which I don't know. I have mixed feelings about how they got Moriarty into the story so early.
Yeah.
But at least with the first episode, it's just like it's just there, At least they don't actually show him yet.
Yeah.
So there is that. But Jeremy Brett talked more than once about wanting to adapt to Study in Scarlet for Granada, although he acknowledged that they would have to use younger actors to do Holmes and Watson. And I don't know if Granada ever seriously themselves wanted to try to do it, but Jeremy did. And he said that something that they would have to figure out is how to handle the Mormon backstory, because he felt that was discriminatory. And I don't, I think I can imagine the kind of problems that he would have with BBC Sherlock on the whole but I have to imagine that he would also have like really liked how A Study in Scarlet was updated in pink, and how the Mormon Baxter was just written right out. And you didn't need
He
that.
would definitely have approved of the relationship between Holmes and Watson.
To an extent. I don't think that he would. I think that he would have been one of the people who doesn't like season 4. But yeah. So yeah, Studying Pink. And that is, I mean, there are other adaptations of Studying Scarlet out there, but I feel like those are kind of the highlights, as far as I know. So, unless anybody else knows of any others. But, yeah, I think that probably means that we can finally conclude this super long episode, super long story discussion. And the next time that we have a story discussion, it is going to be the Gloria Scott. So we're going to talk about like genuine baby Sherlock Holmes. He's like a teenager in that one. And that's going to be fun. But yeah, so any final thoughts about the story before we go?
I think it's fun seeing their first meeting, which like obviously now it's so iconic, but I wonder what it was like reading it back then for the first time, and you had no idea that these are going to become like 2 of the most famous characters in literary history.
Yeah. I know, I was kind of thinking about that myself earlier. Yeah, I'm so, Studying Scarlet is not a perfect story, and it's not as good as other Sherlock Holmes stories, but I'm so glad that we have it. I'm really glad that we have it. And I'm glad that I don't have to bend over backwards to insert Moriarty into it to get back to our Moriarty theme. This is still a Moriarty podcast. It is. So, on that note, I think we are going to say goodbye, and thank you for listening or watching us ramble on, for me especially ramble on for this long about this story, and we hope that you guys enjoyed it. So, thank you and bye.
Bye.